This execution was the darkest, most twisted joke in Tudor history. Friar John Forrest wasn't just burned. He was hung in chains and slowly roasted alive for 2 agonizing hours. The king's men chopped up the massive wooden statue of the saint he worshipped and used it as kindling to burn him. Henry VIII literally turned the man's own faith into the weapon that destroyed him. The real motive wasn't treason. It was a petty, vicious grudge against a dead woman. Forrest was the personal confessor to the rejected queen, Catherine of Aragon, the only man who knew her deepest secrets. Since the king couldn't punish his ex-wife from beyond the grave, he unleashed his fury on her loyal friend instead. It was proxy revenge. Killing Forrest was Henry's way of finally wiping out the last traces of his first marriage. The structure of medieval England was being systematically dismantled by 1538. The dissolution of the monasteries was no longer just a threat. It was a reality of stripped roofs and melted bells. The king's right hand was efficiently erasing the old world to fund the new. It was a cold, bureaucratic process that left no room for sentiment or tradition. London was gripped by paranoia following the Treason Act of 1534. This law shifted the definition of loyalty. It was no longer enough to simply obey the king's actions. You had to agree with his theology, and even silence could be interpreted as a crime. The state had effectively begun to police the private thoughts of every citizen, creating a climate of absolute fear. In this dangerous landscape, John Forrest and the observant friars stood out as an anomaly. Unlike the wealthy and corrupt clergy of the time, they lived in radical poverty and refused to own property. This austerity made them immensely trusted by both the common people and the aristocracy. However, their spiritual independence made them a direct threat to a king who demanded total control. Born in 1471 near Oxford, he was a man of the previous century. By the time of his execution, he was nearly 70 years old. He was not a rabble-rouser from the gutter. He came from a wealthy, perhaps aristocratic family. He was a doctor of theology from Oxford University, a man of sharp intellect and deep learning. He had served as the provincial, the head, of all observant friars in England. This background is crucial. Forrest was not an outsider throwing stones at the establishment. He was a man who had spent his life at the very center of English power. The physical location of Forrest's life explains the danger he posed. The primary friary of the observants was in Greenwich. This was not a random location. The friary was attached to the Royal Palace of Greenwich, the favorite residence of Henry VIII. The architecture reflected the relationship. The friary church was connected to the royal apartments by a private gallery. The king and queen could attend Mass without ever stepping outside. The observant friars were part of the royal household's daily rhythm. They were the king's neighbors. They were the men who baptized the royal children. For years, Henry VIII admired the observants. He wrote letters praising their holiness. He used them as diplomats, but this closeness became a liability when the king's conscience began to shift. John Forrest served as the confessor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. This was a position of immense influence. In the Catholic tradition, the confessor is the guardian of the soul. He hears the penitent's deepest secrets, fears, and sins. He offers guidance not just on prayer, but on moral action. For decades, this relationship was stable. Forrest was a spiritual father to a pious queen. But when Henry VIII fell in love with Anne Boleyn and sought to annul his marriage to Catherine, the role of the confessor changed. It ceased to be a private religious duty and became a matter of high state security. In the late 1520s, as Henry's great matter, the divorce, consumed the court, the pressure on Catherine of Aragon was unimaginable. She was isolated. The king had removed her daughter Mary from her. The nobles who had once fawned over her now avoided her eyes, terrified of offending the king. The bishops of England, led by men like Thomas Cranmer, were largely falling into line, finding theological justifications for the king's desire. Catherine stood almost alone, but she had John Forrest. While the king's lawyers argued that the marriage was invalid because Catherine had previously been married to Henry's brother Arthur, Forrest held the line of canon law. He advised Catherine that her marriage was valid. He told her that she was the rightful Queen of England and the lawful wife of Henry VIII. This was not merely spiritual comfort, it was political defiance. By encouraging Catherine to stand firm, Forrest was directly obstructing the king's will. He was the steel in the queen's spine. Henry VIII was accustomed to getting his way. He could bully Parliament, he could bribe bishops, he could execute nobles, but he could not easily break the bond between a queen and her confessor. The king grew increasingly frustrated. He began to view the observant friars not as holy men, but as agents of a foreign power, the Pope in Rome. The conflict moved from the confessional to the pulpit. In 1532 and 1533, as the king moved closer to breaking with Rome, the observant friars began to preach against him to his face. It is difficult for a modern audience to appreciate the bravery required to do this. Preaching at the Royal Chapel in Greenwich meant standing a few feet away from Henry VIII, a man who was rapidly becoming a tyrant, and telling him he was wrong. In 1534, the hammer fell. The Act of Supremacy was passed. Henry VIII was now the head of the church. The Pope was legally erased. An oath was required of all clergy. They had to swear allegiance to the king's new title and reject the authority of Rome. Most of the clergy in England swore the oath. Some did it out of fear, some out of genuine conviction that the king was right, and many out of a pragmatic desire to survive. The observant friars refused. The response from the crown was swift and brutal. The order was suppressed. The friars were expelled from their houses. Some were chained together and shipped to prisons in different parts of the country. Others fled to Scotland or the continent. Many died of starvation and neglect in the dungeons of London. John Forrest was arrested. However, his treatment was initially curious. He was sent to Newgate Prison, a notorious hell above ground, yet he was not immediately executed. He was an old man, and perhaps the government thought he would simply die of natural causes, saving them the trouble of a trial. For several years, Forrest existed in a strange limbo. He was a prisoner, yet he was allowed a degree of freedom within the prison walls. He could say Mass, he could receive visitors. Amazingly, he continued to correspond with Queen Catherine until her death in 1536. He wrote her letters of encouragement, preparing her for her own end, urging her to remain faithful to the truth, regardless of the cost. But silence was not enough for the new regime. As the year 1538 dawned, the king's patience with the old order had run out. The passive imprisonment of a stubborn friar was no longer a solution. It was an irritation. Thomas Cromwell needed a public victory, a way to demonstrate that even the holiest men of the previous generation were powerless against the new laws of England. The waiting game in Newgate was over. The time for the legal assault had begun. By the spring of 1538, the machinery of the English Reformation had shifted gears. The initial phase, the legal separation from Rome, was complete. King Henry VIII was supreme head of the church. The Pope's name had been erased from prayer books and his authority from the statute books. But Thomas Cromwell, the king's vicegerent in spirituals, understood that changing laws was the easy part. Changing the minds of the English people was a different battle entirely. Cromwell was a master of political theater. He knew that the people of England were largely conservative. They missed the old rituals. They missed the pilgrimages. They were confused by the sudden disappearance of the monasteries that had been the social safety net of the medieval world. To secure the new order, Cromwell needed to do more than just execute dissenters. He needed to humiliate the old faith. He needed to prove that the old symbols of holiness were powerless. It was in this context that the case of John Forrest became useful. The old friar had been languishing in Newgate prison, a forgotten man of the resistance. But Cromwell saw in him an opportunity. Forrest was high profile enough to be an example, yet isolated enough to be vulnerable. Cromwell sent his agents to Newgate. They did not initially use the rack or the thumbscrew. Instead, they used theological debate. They engaged Forrest in long, winding discussions about the nature of the church, the authority of St. Peter, and the role of the king. Forrest was an intellectual, a doctor of divinity from Oxford. He engaged with them. This was his mistake. He believed he was having a disputation, a formal academic debate common in universities, where opposing views could be aired without penalty. He did not realize he was providing evidence for his own destruction. During these sessions, Forrest made a fatal admission. He attempted to explain the complex position of a Catholic living under a schismatic king. He described himself as a double man. He told his interrogators that he owed a dual allegiance. His outward man, his physical body and his actions, belonged to the king. He would obey the king's civil laws, pay his taxes, and respect the king's peace. But his inward man, his soul, his conscience, and his intellect belonged to God, and by extension to the Pope as God's vicar on earth. He frankly admitted that while he might have outwardly conformed to save his life, internally he had never accepted Henry VIII as the head of the church. To a modern ear, this distinction seems reasonable. It is the separation of church and state. But in 1538, it was a death sentence. Cromwell pounced on this admission. If Forrest had simply remained silent, or if he had denied the king's authority as a matter of political conscience, he would have been charged with high treason. The punishment for treason was hanging, drawing, and quartering. It was a gruesome death, but it was the death of a criminal, a traitor to the state. However, by framing his resistance as a matter of inward spiritual belief, a doctrinal refusal to accept the king's supremacy, Forrest allowed Cromwell to change the charge. Cromwell accused him not of treason, but of heresy. This was a critical, lethal maneuver. In Tudor England, the punishment for heresy was burning at the stake. Burning was a punishment traditionally reserved for Lollards, Lutherans, and Anabaptists, people who denied the fundamental dogmas of the church, such as the real presence in the Eucharist. John Forrest believed in the real presence. He believed in the 7 sacraments. He was a rigid Orthodox Catholic. Yet Cromwell managed to twist the definition of heresy. He argued that to deny the king's supremacy was to deny the Word of God, and therefore it was a heresy. This was a radical legal innovation. It meant that a man could be burned alive for being too Catholic. The official indictment against Forrest was drawn up. It was a list of errors that effectively criminalized the standard Catholic faith of the previous 1,000 years. He was condemned to die, but Cromwell was not satisfied with a simple burning. He wanted a show. While Forrest was sitting in his cell in London, events were unfolding hundreds of miles away in the mountains of North Wales that would seal his fate in the most bizarre way possible. In the parish of Llanderfell, in the diocese of St. Asaph, there stood a pilgrimage site. It was dedicated to St. Derfel Gadarn, Derfel the Mighty. Derfel was a semi-legendary figure from the 6th century. According to Welsh tradition, he had been a warrior, a knight of King Arthur's court who had fought at the Battle of Camlan. In his old age, he had put down his sword and become a hermit, living a life of prayer in the Welsh wilderness. For centuries, the Welsh people had venerated his wooden statue. It was a massive object, carved from solid oak, depicting the saint in armor, but holding a staff. Crucially, there was an ancient prophecy attached to this statue. The Welsh saying went, Churi ailoski abidi nefod ian disgyn, or, in the translation that reached London, Derfel Gadarn will one day set a forest on fire. Cromwell's agents were currently scouring Wales, stripping the churches of their wealth. The king's commissary for the region, Ellis Price, wrote to Cromwell about the statue of Derfel. Cromwell, with his dark sense of humor and his eye for symbolism, saw the connection immediately. He had a prisoner named Forrest. He had a statue prophesied to burn a forest. He decided to force the prophecy to come true. He ordered Ellis Price to seize the statue. The reaction in Wales was one of horror. The local people offered a bribe of £40, a staggering sum for a poor rural parish, to save their saint. They begged to keep him. Cromwell refused the money. This was not about greed. It was about power. He wanted the wood. The statue of Derfel Gadarn was torn from its shrine. It was loaded onto a cart and hauled slowly across the rough roads of Wales and England. It was a long, humiliating journey. The mighty Derfel, who had protected his people for centuries, was now just a prisoner of the state, bumping along in the mud. When the statue arrived in London, it became an object of ridicule. Cromwell's men mocked it. They called it a great idol. They pointed out its rough carving, its old paint. They invited the Londoners to laugh at the superstition of the ignorant Welsh. This was a key part of the Reformation's strategy, demystification. By treating a sacred object as a piece of garbage, they hoped to break its power over the popular imagination. The date for the execution was set for May 22nd, 1538. The location was Smithfield, the open space just outside the city walls. Smithfield was the center of London's meat trade. It was a place of cattle markets, butchery, and blood. It was also the traditional site for public executions. But the preparations for this day were unlike anything the city had seen before. Usually a stake was a simple wooden post driven into the ground. Faggots, bundles of brushwood, would be piled around it. For John Forrest, the government commissioned a special structure. They built a gallows, a large crossbeam supported by two uprights. From the center of the beam, they hung heavy iron chains. This was the cradle. The plan was specific. Forrest would not be tied to a stake. He would be suspended in the air, wrapped in chains, dangling over the fire. And the fuel for that fire would not be ordinary wood. Beneath the gallows, the executioners began to chop up the statue of Derfel Gadarn. The ancient oak, seasoned by centuries of candle smoke and prayer, was split into blocks. The warrior saint was reduced to kindling. As the morning of the 22nd dawned, the crowds began to gather. 10,000 people filled the market square. This was a state occasion. A massive tiered platform had been erected for the dignitaries. The Duke of Norfolk, the premier peer of the realm, was there. The Duke of Suffolk, the king's brother-in-law, was there. And Thomas Cromwell sat in the center, the architect of the day's events. They sat comfortably, high above the mud and the stench of the market, waiting for the show to begin. They were there to witness the end of the double man. They were there to see if the friar who had defied a king could withstand the fire of a saint. With the legal trap set and the idol secured, the stage was now fully prepared. London held its breath. The pieces of Cromwell's dark puzzle were moving toward their final configuration at Smithfield. The intellectual who refused to lie, and the wooden saint who was destined to burn. The theological debate was finished. Now the theater of cruelty would take its place. The journey from Newgate Prison to Smithfield was short in distance, less than half a mile, but it was designed to be an eternity of humiliation. On the morning of May 22nd, 1538, the gates of Newgate opened. John Forrest was brought out. He was 67 years old, his body wasted by years of confinement and the poor diet of the prison. He had been stripped of his religious habit, the gray wool of the observant friars, that had defined his identity for decades. In its place, he wore a simple gown, leaving him shivering in the cool spring air. He was not permitted to walk. In the theater of Tudor justice, a traitor had to be dragged. He was strapped to a hurdle, a flat wooden sled or a panel of wicker. He was tied down flat on his back, his head bumping against the rough timber. A horse was hitched to the front of the hurdle. As the horse moved forward, Forrest was dragged through the mire of the London streets. The cobblestones were uneven, slick with mud and the refuse of the city. The hurdle offered no suspension. Every jolt of the road was transferred directly to the old man's spine. Crowds lined the route. The mood was complex. For the convinced Protestants, this was a victory parade, the final defeat of a stubborn papist. For the closet Catholics, and there were still thousands in London, it was a procession of martyrdom. They watched in silence as the Queen's confessor was dragged through the dirt like a common murderer. When the procession arrived at Smithfield, the scale of the production became clear. The open space, usually smelling of livestock and manure, was today smelling of anticipation. The large, purpose-built scaffolding for the nobility dominated the skyline. The Duke of Norfolk and the Duke of Suffolk sat in their finery. Next to them sat Thomas Cromwell. It is worth pausing to consider Cromwell's view. He was looking at the culmination of months of planning. He had orchestrated the legal statutes, the interrogation, the transport of the statue from Wales, and the construction of the gallows. He was the stage manager of this death. In the center of the square stood the cradle of chains. It was a grim industrial structure, a gallows equipped with heavy iron chains and a noose, designed not to kill quickly, but to hold the victim in place for a prolonged duration. Beneath the chains lay the jumbled pile of wood. To the uninitiated, it looked like ordinary timber. But to those who knew, the painted eyes and carved hands of the mighty Durfel were visible in the heap. The executioners had done their work thoroughly, chopping the saint into unrecognizable chunks, but the symbolism remained. Forrest was untied from the hurdle. He stood up unsteady on his feet, brushing the filth from his clothes. He was led to the gallows. The executioners, strong men stripped to the waist, lifted him up. They did not tie him to a stake. They wrapped the heavy iron chains around his waist and under his armpits. They hoisted him into the air, suspending him well above the ground. He was left dangling, his feet swaying above the pile of sacred firewood. But the fire was not lit yet. The physical torture had to wait for the psychological torture. A pulpit had been erected directly facing the gallows. Into this pulpit stepped Hugh Latimer, the Bishop of Worcester. Latimer was one of the most dynamic and controversial figures of the Reformation. He was a brilliant orator, a man of simple, earthy humor and ferocious conviction. He was a true believer in the new religion. He honestly believed that the Pope was the Antichrist and that the Catholic rituals were idolatry that endangered souls. Cromwell had handpicked Latimer for this task. It was not an easy assignment. The sermon began. It was not a brief eulogy. It was a marathon of theology. For nearly 3 hours, Forrest hung in the chains, but the fire remained unlit. The executioners stood back with their torches, waiting. The torture at this stage was not heat, but gravity and humiliation. The iron bit into his underarms. His circulation was slowly cutting off. His old body was aching in the damp air of Smithfield. While he dangled there, helpless but conscious, Bishop Latimer preached at him from the pulpit. The scene was surreal. One man suspended in iron, the other standing in a pulpit, engaged in a one-sided debate. Latimer used every trick of rhetoric. He cajoled, he threatened, he mocked. He pointed to the chopped-up statue beneath Forrest's feet. "Look at your idol," he might have shouted. "See how helpless he is? He cannot save himself from the axe. How can he save you from hell?" He attacked the authority of the Pope. He attacked the rotten traditions of the past. He told the crowd that Forrest was not a martyr, but a traitor, a man so obstinate, so blinded by the devil, that he refused to see the light of the gospel and the king's righteous supremacy. It was a public dismantling of Forrest's entire life. Every mass he had celebrated, every confession he had heard, every prayer he had whispered to Queen Catherine, Latimer declared it all to be lies and superstition. The government hoped that under this barrage, Forrest would break. They wanted him to weep, to scream for mercy, to admit that Latimer was right. A recantation at the stake would be the ultimate propaganda victory. But Forrest did not break. Witnesses record that even while hanging in the chains, the old friar possessed a terrifying composure. He listened to the sermon. And when Latimer finally paused to ask if he would repent, Forrest answered. He did not whisper. He spoke loudly enough for the dignitaries to hear. "I will die in the faith of the Holy Catholic Church," Forrest declared. He then turned his gaze on Latimer. The two men knew each other. They were old adversaries. Forrest reminded the bishop of his own past. "7 years ago," Forrest shouted, "you durst not have made such a sermon for your life." It was a cutting remark. It reminded everyone present that Latimer, and indeed Henry VIII himself, had once been devout Catholics. It accused Latimer of being a turncoat, a man who changed his theology to suit the political winds. Forrest continued, delivering his final manifesto. "And if an angel should come down from heaven and show me any other thing than that which I have believed all my lifetime, I would not believe him." He looked at the pile of wood. He looked at Cromwell. "Neither fire nor faggot, nor any torment shall separate me from thee, O Lord." The sermon was a failure. The prisoner had not converted. He had counterattacked. The crowd, rather than jeering at the heretic, was growing uneasy. There was a dignity in the old man's defiance that demanded respect even from enemies. Cromwell saw that the time for words was over. He signaled to the executioners. Bishop Latimer stepped down from the pulpit, perhaps relieved that his part in the grisly affair was done. The theatrical prologue was finished. Now, the real horror would begin. The executioners approached the pyre. They carried torches. The crowd fell silent. The wind picked up, swirling across the open plain of Smithfield. It whistled through the gaps in the statue of Derfel Gadarn. Forrest began to pray. He did not pray for the king. He did not pray for England. He prayed in Latin, the language of the church he refused to abandon. Miserere me, Deus. Have mercy on me, God. The torch touched the dry wood of the statue. The wood of the ancient image was old and seasoned. It caught quickly. But the execution was not standard. In a typical burning, the victim is tied low to the ground, and the smoke often brings unconsciousness before the flames do their worst work. But Forrest was suspended high in the cradle. He was above the initial plume of smoke. The fire began to crackle. The flames licked upward, consuming the carved armor of the wooden saint. The heat began to rise. The prophecy was being fulfilled in real time. Derfel Gadarn was setting a forest on fire. The smell of burning oak mixed with the smell of burning flesh. And still the friar did not scream for the king's mercy. He beat his breast with one hand that was still free from the chains. He continued to pray. The minutes ticked by. It was not a quick flash of violence. It was a slow, grinding process of destruction. The man who had been the spiritual rock for a queen was being turned to ash, inch by inch, by the machinery of the new state. The execution of John Forrest became a durational event, a slow-motion atrocity that tested the stomach of every spectator. Because he was suspended high in the cradle, he was denied the mercy of the smoke. He was forced to remain fully awake for an agonizing duration. Some sources record it stretching to 2 hours. The crowd watched a man being consumed by increments. It ceased to be an execution and became a biological dismantling. They saw him writhe in the chains, his body instinctively trying to curl away from the heat rising from the statue below. Yet, the silence of the victim was louder than the roar of the fire. He did not scream for the king. He did not beg Cromwell for a quick death. He simply beat his breast with his one free hand, a rhythmic, repetitive motion that continued until he physically could not lift his arm. His lips moved in constant prayer. Domine miserere me. Lord, have mercy on me. The psychological impact on the spectators was profound. The government had designed this spectacle to humiliate a heretic, to show a man abandoned by God. Instead, they were showing a man with a superhuman capacity for suffering. The laughter that had accompanied the arrival of the idle Derfo Gadarn died out. The mood shifted from a carnival to a somber, fearful witness. Eventually, the laws of physics took over. The massive wooden statue of Derfo Gadarn, the fuel for this atrocity, began to disintegrate. The oak, which had stood for centuries in the Welsh mountains, turned to charcoal and ash. As the base of the fire consumed the support beams of the gallows, the structure became unstable. The chains, glowing red hot, could no longer hold the weight of the body. With a crash that sent sparks flying into the London sky, the gallows toppled. John Forrest, or what remained of him, fell into the heart of the pyre. The body of the Queen's Confessor and the body of the Welsh saint were finally united in the embers. The fire flared up one last time, consuming the last of the double man. The executioners stepped forward to ensure the work was done. They poked at the remains with long poles, breaking up the bones to ensure they burned completely. It was essential that nothing remained. There could be no relics. There could be no shrine. The government wanted total erasure. The burning of John Forrest was a signal fire. It marked the beginning of a new phase in the English Reformation, the war on memory. Until this moment, the king's quarrel had been largely legal and financial. He had broken with the Pope and taxed the clergy, but the destruction of Derfel Gadarn and the burning of Forrest introduced a new violence against the physical objects of faith. Cromwell realized that as long as the physical symbols of the old religion remained, the statues, the shrines, the relics, the people would never truly accept the new order. The execution at Smithfield was a pilot program for iconoclasm. In the months and years that followed, the destruction that started with Derfel Gadarn spread across England. The great shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury, the most holy place in England, was dismantled. The gold was carted off to the royal treasury, filling 26 wagons, and the saints' bones were burned. Statues of Our Lady from Walsingham, Ipswich, and Caversham were hauled to London and burned at Chelsea in a grim echo of the Smithfield fire. The Rood of Grace from Boxley Abbey, a mechanical crucifix that could move its eyes and lips, was paraded through the streets, mocked as a fraud, and destroyed. The message was consistent. The holy is not in the object. The king is the only conduit of God's will. The death of Forrest was the final nail in the coffin of the observant friars. They had been the elite guard of the Catholic Church, the only order to offer unified resistance to Henry VIII. Now they were broken. Those who had not died in prison or been executed were scattered. Some fled to the continent, living in exile in France or the Netherlands. Others, broken by the pressure, finally capitulated and swore the oath. They were absorbed into the conventual Franciscans or became secular priests. But the memory of the observance lingered. They were the men who had dared to tell the king he was wrong to his face. In a court filled with sycophants and yes-men, their silence was deafening. In the end, the strange prophecy of the Welsh mountains did come true, though not in the way the pilgrims had hoped, nor entirely in the way Cromwell had intended. Derfel Gadarn will set a forest on fire. Cromwell believed he was mocking the prophecy by using the wooden saint to burn the friar named Forrest. He thought he was proving that prophecies were nonsense, the mutterings of ignorant peasants. But history is long, and irony is patient. The fire at Smithfield did not extinguish the resistance. It illuminated the tyranny. By burning a man for the heresy of loyalty to the Pope, Henry VIII proved that his new church was built on a foundation of absolute obedience enforced by terror. The smoke from that fire lingered over England for a generation. It was the smell of the old world burning to make way for the new. It reminded the people that their king was now the master of their souls as well as their bodies. John Forrest became the only Catholic martyr to be burned at the stake under Henry VIII for the specific issue of supremacy. Others were beheaded like Thomas More and John Fisher, or hanged, drawn, and quartered like the Carthusian monks. Forrest alone was given the heretic's death. He remains a singular figure, a man caught between two ages, a double man who refused to split his conscience. In the fire at Smithfield, the duality ended. The outward man was destroyed, but the inward man remained, in the eyes of his co-religionists, untouched. The ashes were swept away into the gutters of Smithfield, washed into the Fleet River, and carried out to the Thames. But the story remained. It is the story of a wooden saint, an iron king, and a friar who walked into the fire rather than bow to a lie. The physical destruction of John Forrest was total. The state had done its worst, reducing a human being and a sacred icon to indistinguishable ash. But as the smoke cleared over Smithfield, a strange quiet descended. The men who had orchestrated this horror, Cromwell, Latimer, and the king himself, believed they had secured their power forever. They could not see that the fire they lit would eventually consume them too. History has a grim sense of symmetry. The death of John Forrest was orchestrated by powerful men who believed they were on the right side of history. They sat on high platforms watching the friar burn, confident in their safety and their righteousness. But the wheel of fortune in Tudor England turned with terrifying speed. Within a few short years, almost every major figure who stood on the scaffold at Smithfield would meet a violent end. Thomas Cromwell, the mastermind behind the great idol stunt and the execution, was at the zenith of his power in 1538. He seemed untouchable, yet just 2 years later, in July 1540, the king turned on him. The man who had sent hundreds to their deaths was arrested at the council table. He was stripped of his titles, accused of treason and heresy, the very weapons he had used against Forrest, and beheaded on Tower Hill. He died professing to be a good Catholic, a final desperate attempt to salvage his soul, or perhaps his family's future. Hugh Latimer, the bishop who preached the 3-hour sermon while Forrest dangled in the chains, also found that fire is a fickle weapon. Under the reign of Henry's Catholic daughter, Mary I, the tables turned completely. In 1555, 17 years after he mocked Forrest, Latimer was himself condemned for heresy. He was burned at the stake in Oxford. As the flames rose around him, he famously told his companion, "Play the man, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England." as I trust shall never be put out. One wonders if in his final moments of agony, his mind flashed back to the friar he had bullied at Smithfield. And what of Henry VIII? The king who burned his wife's confessor lived on for another 9 years, but they were years of decline, pain, and paranoia. The ulcer on his leg, likely osteomyelitis, oozed and stank, causing him constant, maddening pain. He became obese, immobile, and tyrannical. By killing men like Forrest, Henry had removed the brakes from his conscience. There was no one left to tell him no. He married 3 more times, beheading another wife, Catherine Howard, along the way. He bankrupted the treasury fighting pointless wars. He died in 1547, leaving behind a child king, Edward VI, and a nation that was religiously fractured, financially ruined, and deeply traumatized. The absolute power he sought had been achieved, but the price was the soul of his kingdom. The government of Henry VIII tried to erase John Forrest. They burned his body to ash. They destroyed the statue he was burned with. Forrest's writings dispel this myth. In a letter to his brethren of the observant order, he confessed his terror. He did not want to die. The prospect of the pains of death kept him awake at night. He wrote, "I am not one of those who do not fear death. I am terrified of the torments." This admission makes his eventual conduct at Smithfield even more remarkable. He was not immune to fear. He was simply unwilling to be ruled by it. He described a spiritual battle taking place in his cell. On one shoulder, the devil whispered to him, reminding him of the pleasures of life, the warmth of the sun, and the agony of the fire. On the other, his conscience demanded loyalty to the truth. He wrote about the temptation to compromise. It is a hard thing to part with life, but it is harder still to be separated from God. Forrest's influence extended beyond the Queen. He was also the confessor to many of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, including Elizabeth Hammond, a maid of honor. When the persecution began, these women were in a precarious position. They were surrounded by the king's spies. To remain loyal to Catherine and the old faith was dangerous. Forrest wrote to Elizabeth Hammond from prison. His advice was stark. He warned her against the pestilence of the new teachings spreading at court. He described the court not as a place of honor, but as a trap for the soul. "Stay in the ship of Peter," he urged her. "The storms are high, the waves are crashing, but the ship cannot sink." This maritime metaphor was powerful. He was telling her that the current political reality, the king's supremacy, was just a storm. It was temporary. The church was eternal. It was a plea for the long view of history, asking a young woman to bet her life on eternity rather than the immediate safety of the king's favor. Why did he do it? Why not just swear the oath? Many bishops did. Stephen Gardiner, Cuthbert Tunstall, and initially even Edmund Bonner. These were learned, conservative men who swore the oath of supremacy. They rationalized it. They argued that the king was anointed by God, that the pope was a distant foreign prince, and that obeying the king was a biblical command. Forrest's letters reveal why he could not accept this compromise. For Forrest, the papacy was not a political office. It was the glue of Christendom. He argued that if the king could declare himself head of the church in England, then the king of France could do the same in France and the king of Spain in Spain. The universal church would shatter into national fragments, each serving the whims of a local tyrant. The truth of the gospel would become subject to the borders of a map. He saw the act of supremacy as the privatization of truth. If Henry VIII determined what was heresy, then truth was whatever Henry VIII happened to feel that morning. Forrest believed that truth had to be external to the state, unchangeable by any king. In his interrogation, he famously said, "I would rather my body be torn into 1,000 pieces than my soul be torn from the unity of the church. We must also consider what we don't have. Forrest wrote a book or a treatise explicitly arguing against the king's supremacy. This book was one of the primary pieces of evidence against him. It was titled De Auctoritate Ecclesiae et Pontificis, on the authority of the church and the pope. Cromwell's agents seized it. It was suppressed and likely destroyed. No copy is known to survive today. The loss of this book is a tragedy for historians. It likely contained the intellectual bedrock of the observant resistance. It was the counter-argument to the king's propaganda. Its destruction reminds us that the Reformation was not just a battle of ideas, it was a battle of censorship. The state did not just kill the author, it killed the argument. However, the letters that did survive, copied by friends, hidden in breviaries, smuggled to Spain, were enough. They circulated in the Catholic underground for decades. For the recusants, Catholics who refused to attend Anglican services, under Elizabeth I, John Forrest's letters were a survival manual. They taught a generation of English Catholics how to live as internal exiles, how to be loyal Englishmen while rejecting the state religion. Forrest's voice whispering from the dark of Newgate became louder after his death. He defined the paradigm of the English Catholic martyr, not a rebel with a sword, but a witness with a pen and a prayer, standing firm against the overwhelming power of the state. These secret letters, whispered from the dungeon to the court, revealed the man behind the martyr. But outside the prison walls, the consequences of his death were just beginning to be felt. Forrest's writings dispel this myth. In a letter to his brethren of the observant order, he confessed his terror. He did not want to die. The prospect of the pains of death kept him awake at night. He wrote, "I am not one of those who do not fear death. I am terrified of the torments." This admission makes his eventual conduct at Smithfield even more remarkable. He was not immune to fear. He was simply unwilling to be ruled by it. He described a spiritual battle taking place in his cell. On one shoulder, the devil whispered to him, reminding him of the pleasures of life, the warmth of the sun and the agony of the fire. On the other, his conscience demanded loyalty to the truth. He wrote about the temptation to compromise. It is a hard thing to part with life, but it is harder still to be separated from God. Forrest's influence extended beyond the Queen. He was also the confessor to many of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, including Elizabeth Hammond, a maid of honor. When the persecution began, these women were in a precarious position. They were surrounded by the king's spies. To remain loyal to Catherine and the old faith was dangerous. Forrest wrote to Elizabeth Hammond from prison. His advice was stark. He warned her against the pestilence of the new teachings spreading at court. He described the court not as a place of honor, but as a trap for the soul. "Stay in the ship of Peter," he urged her. "The storms are high. The waves are crashing, but the ship cannot sink." This maritime metaphor was powerful. He was telling her that the current political reality, the king's supremacy, was just a storm. It was temporary. The church was eternal. It was a plea for the long view of history, asking a young woman to bet her life on eternity rather than the immediate safety of the king's favor. Why did he do it? Why not just swear the oath? Many bishops did. Stephen Gardiner, Cuthbert Tunstall, and initially even Edmund Bonner. These were learned, conservative men who swore the oath of supremacy. They rationalized it. They argued that the king was anointed by God, that the pope was a distant foreign prince, and that obeying the king was a biblical command. Forrest's letters reveal why he could not accept this compromise. For Forrest, the papacy was not a political office. It was the glue of Christendom. He argued that if the king could declare himself head of the church in England, then the King of France could do the same in France, and the King of Spain in Spain. The universal church would shatter into national fragments, each serving the whims of a local tyrant. The truth of the gospel would become subject to the borders of a map. He saw the act of supremacy as the privatization of truth. If Henry VIII determined what was heresy, then truth was whatever Henry VIII happened to feel that morning. Forrest believed that truth had to be external to the state, unchangeable by any king. In his interrogation, he famously said, "I would rather my body be torn into 1,000 pieces than my soul be torn from the unity of the church." We must also consider what we don't have. Forrest wrote a book or a treatise explicitly arguing against the king's supremacy. This book was one of the primary pieces of evidence against him. It was titled De Auctoritate Ecclesiae et Pontificis, on the authority of the church and the pope. Cromwell's agents seized it. It was suppressed and likely destroyed. No copy is known to survive today. The loss of this book is a tragedy for historians. It likely contained the intellectual bedrock of the observant resistance. It was the counter-argument to the king's propaganda. Its destruction reminds us that the Reformation was not just a battle of ideas, it was a battle of censorship. The state did not just kill the author, it killed the argument. However, the letters that did survive, copied by friends, hidden in breviaries smuggled to Spain, were enough. They circulated in the Catholic underground for decades. For the recusants, Catholics who refused to attend Anglican services, under Elizabeth I, John Forrest's letters were a survival manual. They taught a generation of English Catholics how to live as internal exiles, how to be loyal Englishmen while rejecting the state religion. Forrest's voice, whispering from the dark of Newgate, became louder after his death. He defined the paradigm of the English Catholic martyr, not a rebel with a sword, but a witness with a pen and a prayer, standing firm against the overwhelming power of the state. These secret letters, whispered from the dungeon to the court, revealed the man behind the martyr. But outside the prison walls, the consequences of his death were just beginning to be felt. The burning of Friar Forrest was not an ending, but a beginning, a signal for a campaign of destruction that would sweep across the entire landscape of English faith. The burning of John Forrest was intended as a domestic lesson, a terrifying piece of theater for the citizens of London. But in the 16th century, London was a stage watched by all of Europe. The execution sent shockwaves through the diplomatic channels of Christendom, confirming to the Catholic powers that Henry VIII had moved beyond mere schism into something far darker. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador from the Holy Roman Empire, was the primary conduit for this news. Chapuis was a veteran diplomat, a man who had seen wars and intrigues, yet his dispatches regarding Forrest reveal a genuine horror. He wrote to Emperor Charles V, describing the execution not just as a killing, but as a calculated act of sacrilege. To the Catholic powers of Spain and France, the use of a saint's statue as firewood was a deliberate provocation. It was a signal that the English king no longer feared the judgment of the church or the wrath of his fellow monarchs. It cemented England's status as a rogue state in the eyes of Rome. The Pope, Paul III, was appalled. The execution of a man of Forrest's standing, a former provincial of a respected order, and a Queen's confessor, was a direct challenge to papal authority. It contributed to the drafting of the Bull of Excommunication against Henry, a document that would officially cast the English king out of the fold of the faithful, though its implementation was delayed by political caution. In England, however, the immediate reaction was silence. This was the Great Silence that descended upon the country during the terror of Thomas Cromwell. The people of London had watched the spectacle at Smithfield. They had seen the double man roast. They had heard the cracking of the wooden saint, and they understood the message perfectly. If the king could burn the Queen's Confessor and a Welsh saint in one fire, no one was safe. There were no riots. There were no public protests. The opposition to the Reformation, which had bubbled up in the Pilgrimage of Grace just 2 years earlier, was effectively stunned into submission. Forrest's death demonstrated that the government was willing to violate the deepest taboos of the culture to enforce its will. This silence was not acceptance, it was survival. It was the birth of the Nicodemite tradition in England, named after Nicodemus, the biblical figure who visited Jesus by night. English Catholics began to practice their faith in the shadows, outwardly conforming to the king's laws while secretly holding to the old ways. They became, by necessity, exactly what Forrest had been accused of being, double men. The destruction of Vengeful was more than a singular act of spite, it was a pilot program for a cultural revolution. Cromwell used the event to test the waters. He watched the crowd at Smithfield closely. When the sky did not fall, and the people did not riot as their mighty saint turned to ash, he knew he could go further. The burning of Forrest provided the psychological permission the state needed to escalate its war on sacred objects. The blueprint tested at Smithfield, seize the idol, mock it publicly, and destroy it, was simply rolled out across the nation. The fires that would later consume the treasures of Canterbury and the statues of Walsingham were all lit, metaphorically, from the embers of that first fire at Smithfield. History is written by the victors, and for centuries, the history of the English Reformation was written by Protestants. The primary text was John Fox's Acts and Monuments, popularly known as the Book of Martyrs. Fox's book is a massive catalog of those who died for the Protestant faith under Queen Mary I, Bloody Mary. It details their sufferings in graphic, heroic terms, but when it came to Catholic martyrs like John Forrest, Fox faced a problem. He could not deny that Forrest was burned, but he could not make him a hero. To Fox, Forrest was an obstinate papist who died for a lie. Consequently, in the standard Protestant narrative, Forrest's death was often minimized or framed as a just punishment for treason. Fox describes Forrest not as a martyr, but as a traitor who received his due. He focuses on the superstition of the Welsh statue, mocking the idol Vengeful. For centuries, this was the dominant view in English history books. Forrest was a stubborn old man who stood in the way of progress. While the official history books marginalized him, the Catholic underground kept Forrest's memory alive. For the recusants, those who refused to attend the new Anglican services, Forrest was a proto-martyr. He was the first to face the specific dilemma that would confront all English Catholics for the next 300 years: how to choose between the crown and the cross. His letters were copied by hand and passed from house to house. His name was whispered in secret masses, held in attic chapels. The story of the burning of the idol became a dark folk tale, a reminder of the sacrilege of the state. When Queen Mary I took the throne in 1553, there was a brief attempt to restore his memory publicly. The observant friars were recalled to Greenwich. They rebuilt their friary. They surely prayed for the soul of their murdered brother on the very ground where he had once walked with the king. But Mary died in 1558, and Elizabeth I reimposed the Protestant settlement. The friars were expelled again, and the silence returned. It took 350 years for the Catholic Church to officially recognize John Forrest. During the Reformation, Rome was often slow to canonize the English martyrs, partly to avoid further antagonizing the English government, and partly because the records were scattered. In the late 19th century, A new wave of interest in the English martyrs emerged. The archives were opened, the letters of Chapuis, and the chronicles of the friars were re-examined. On December 9th, 1886, Pope Leo XIII beatified John Forrest. He was given the title Blessed. His feast day was set for May 22nd, the anniversary of his roasting. He is not yet a saint, he has not been canonized, but he is venerated as one of the most significant figures of the resistance. In the iconography of the English Church, he is often depicted in his gray habit, sometimes with a flame or a chain, standing beside the ghost of the Queen he served. If you walk through Smithfield in London today, it is a place of ghosts. The great livestock market is gone, though the Victorian market building remains. It is a quiet, somewhat eerie part of the city, dominated by the ancient walls of St. Bartholomew's Hospital. There is a memorial at Smithfield, but it is primarily dedicated to the Protestant martyrs burned by Queen Mary I. Their names are listed on a plaque, honored for their sacrifice. John Forrest has no great statue. There is no plaque on the spot where the cradle of chains stood. The ground where the ashes of the double man and the warrior saint mingled has been paved over countless times. But for those who know the history, the air at Smithfield still carries the scent of that spring morning in 1538. It is the site of one of the most peculiar and brutal events in British history, a moment when a king tried to burn a prophecy, and in doing so, immortalize the man he tried to erase. The physical scars on the land, the ruined abbeys and the empty shrines, were visible to all. But the execution of John Forrest left a deeper, invisible scar on the English legal system. To fully grasp the significance of John Forrest's death, one must look beyond the spectacle of the fire to the legal revolution it represented. Forrest's confession of being a double man was treated by Cromwell as a crime, but historically, it was a prophecy of the modern world. Forrest was arguably articulating for the first time in English law the concept of the separation between the secular state and the sacred conscience. By transforming Forrest's political refusal into a religious heresy, Cromwell blurred the ancient lines between treason and theology. He established a terrifying precedent that the state owned not just the body of the subject, but his internal thoughts. Forrest died because he lived in an era that had not yet invented the concept of private opinion. He argued that a citizen could obey the civil laws, the outward man, while holding spiritual beliefs that differed from the government, the inward man. Today we call this religious freedom. In 1538, Henry VIII called it death. One of the most tragic elements of this story is the personal relationship between the victim and the executioner. John Forrest was not a stranger to Henry VIII. In the early years of the reign, Henry was a frequent visitor to the Greenwich Friary. He knew Forrest. He had likely conversed with him, attended his masses, and perhaps even sought his counsel. They were men of the same generation. Forrest was older, but they shared the same intellectual world of Renaissance humanism and devout Catholicism. The burning of Forrest reveals the catastrophic decay of Henry's character. By 1538, the Golden Prince of the Renaissance had become a paranoid tyrant. But it was more than just paranoia, it was a specific kind of vindictiveness. Henry could not bear to be reminded of his past. Forrest, by his very existence, was a living reminder of Catherine's England, the days when Henry was a faithful husband and a loyal son of the Pope. Forrest represented the moral authority that Henry had discarded. Psychologically, Henry had to kill Forrest, not because Forrest was a threat to the throne. An old friar in prison could hardly lead an army, but because Forrest was a threat to Henry's ego. As long as Forrest lived and refused to submit, He was a silent witness to the king's moral collapse. By burning him, Henry was trying to burn his own bad conscience. Cromwell and his agents were masters of spin. They carefully curated the execution at Smithfield to be a moment of national unity. They drafted the sermon, imported the idol, and built the stage. They wanted the crowd to laugh at the friar and the wooden saint. But accounts suggest the propaganda backfired. The English people were fond of their idols. They loved their saints. Seeing the mighty Derfel chopped up and burned didn't necessarily make them enlightened Protestants. For many, it just made them sad and fearful. Furthermore, the sight of a 67-year-old man, a figure of known holiness, being roasted in chains did not inspire love for the king's new church. It inspired horror. Instead of proving that the Pope was the Antichrist, the fire at Smithfield suggested to the common people that the king might be the one losing his way. It drove the resistance underground, where it hardened into a resolve that would trouble the English crown for centuries. The story of Friar John Forrest is a dark chapter, smelling of smoke and betrayal. It is the story of a dark pun, burning a forest with a forest, gone horribly wrong. Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell succeeded in their immediate goal. They killed the man. They destroyed the statue. They silenced the order. But in the long arc of history, they failed. They tried to make Forrest a symbol of treason. Instead, they became a symbol of integrity. They tried to show that the state owns the soul. Instead, they proved that the soul is the one thing the state cannot conquer. When John Forrest looked at the powerful men sitting on the scaffold and said, "Neither fire nor faggot, nor any torment shall separate me from thee, O Lord," he was declaring the ultimate independence of the human spirit. In the end, the double man was not divided. He was the only one at Smithfield who was truly whole.